In this video, we are going to be making this pink flower card painting. To start out, we want to get our sketch onto our watercolor paper, and I have a couple options here in the PDFs. One is darker, and this is if you want to trace your image. It makes it a little bit easier to see through your paper. And then this lighter one here works great if you have a laser printer. So that's a printer that has toner and not ink. If you use an inkjet printer, this will smear if it gets wet with the watercolor paint. So the important thing is when you go to print it, make sure you check the settings that the scale is at 100% if you want this to be a 5x7 card. You can shrink it to make it smaller, you just might not know the exact size. Also, I don't print on both sides because I want to be able to see through this one to trace. So I go ahead and print that, and then I'll show you how to trace this onto your watercolor paper. This is what it'll look like printed on just regular printer paper, and this is ready for tracing. This is the lighter version that you're going to want to print onto watercolor paper if you have that option. If you are going to trace this in a sunny window or a light box, it helps to tape your paper down where you want it, either on the light box or in the window, so that things don't move around. You can still move around the paper underneath like this, so you also want to tape the bottom paper. And this takes a little bit more time, but it's not too hard. You'll want to use a ruler to get these straight lines to outline the card. But basically, you can just go gently over your card, either with a mechanical pencil or just a regular HD pencil. And you're going to go over all of those main lines. You want to go pretty light because you want to be able to erase any lines so it doesn't show through as much with your paint. You don't have to use a light box for this. This can also be done in a sunny window. If you are using a light box, it does help to close any blinds just so the room isn't as bright and you'll be able to see through this paper a little bit easier. So this is a really nice way. It's harder for more detailed sketches, but with this flower, it's pretty simple, so it's not too hard to trace. Just make sure you're tracing lightly and you're not pushing too hard into your paper. We want these lines to kind of be disguised with our painting so that it doesn't take over the watercolor. If you don't have a light box to trace it, a sunny window works just as well. You can see how good that comes through just hanging up in the window. I would just make sure you tape both of the papers to make sure they don't move. This last way of getting your sketch onto watercolor paper is by far the easiest, but you have to have a laser printer. All you need to do is cut your paper down to fit inside of your printer. So I cut it down to an 8.5 by 11. And then I open the front flap of my printer and the back flap. If you don't have a front and a back flap, it can come through your printer instead of staying flat, but it might get jammed, so be aware of that. And then I just load it in through the front and I wait for it to kind of grip onto the paper. And then I print it like I just printed my first sheet. And make sure you use the lighter image so that it doesn't get too dark of toner on your paper. Now this sketch is ready to trim and paint. I'm going to trim around just the outside part, and then I'm going to leave the middle untouched, and we're going to fold that at the end, just so it's a little bit easier to paint and it's not popping up on us. So you can just use scissors to trim this down, or if you have a paper cutter, it's a little bit faster. We're going to start by taping our paper down to our board. You don't have to tape it down to your surface that you're painting on. It just helps to not have things be wiggling around as you work. And I like to put it on a board so that I can manipulate how much it's tilted. But in this case, we're not doing a lot of big washes, so it's okay if it's just flat on your table or you're just holding it. And I usually tape the back just with little rolled up pieces of tape. If I'm doing a large wash, I'll tape down all the sides. But since we're just painting this flower, it's not really necessary to stretch our paper. So we're going to start by getting our palette wet, and I just like to use a spray bottle. And I have this little palette linked on the supply list. You can use whatever paints you have. I have really liked these paints and it's pretty affordable and it has all the colors. I don't use these for my pet portraits as much because there aren't as many browns, but this is great for like my summer course or classes where I have a lot of different colors and things going on. So we're going to start off with our little liner brush, our 10/0 liner brush, and we're going to really gently outline some of our sketch so that we don't lose it. And I use a lot of water in this part because I don't want it to be too dark. I want to be able to layer on top. And this is pretty green, so I'm just going to add a little bit of brown to it. This is my burnt umber, just to kind of tone down that saturation a bit. So it has quite a bit of water on there. I'm just going to gently go over my sketch. If you printed your sketch, this toner from the printer can kind of rub off if you rub your hand over it. So this is just kind of a nice way to preserve it, and so as you work up layers, you also don't lose that initial sketch. That's a little bit light. I might want to add a little bit more pigment to my paint. So the more pigment to water ratio you have, it's going to make it darker. And it'll change how thick it is. So in this case, I needed just a little bit more so I could see it a little bit better. And I can even fill in these entire stems that are really thin here. And you don't have to paint this pink like I'm about to do with this flower. You don't have to follow the reference photo. If you want to use a different color, you can totally do that too. And we aren't going to worry too much about making this look exactly like our reference photo, but we just want to use it as a guide. I'm not going to try to mix the exact pinks. It just helps it look a little more realistic if we have something we're working from instead of just making it up out of our head. So I've just really carefully gone over these. If I'm working faster than you, you can always pause the video. So I got that part in. Now I want to find some of my pinks. So I have this rose color here and it's kind of purpley, which I like. I'm going to add quite a bit of water to it. And I just want to kind of go over these initial lines. I'm not going to go over every single one, just the main ones here so that I don't lose it as I work. And we're going to be looking for the high contrast areas. And once we laid those down, it makes it easier to kind of see how dark we should be painting everything else. So you'll see just how much water is mixed into this paint. It's really light and I'm not going harsh on this at all. I want to be able to blend this into other layers. Let's start outlining this middle part too. I'm going to use my azo yellow, just so we don't lose that little center part of our flower. I like doing these outlines too because it kind of maps out the colors and kind of gives me an idea of where I will be placing things. So the trick with these petals on this flower is we're going to be looking at each individual petal and painting in those values. So we're going to mix some of our darker rose color. This is going to be the darkest parts of the flower. And then I'm going to pull out some of my ultramarine deep color off to the side. And we're going to be using that as some shadows to add a little bit of interest. So I'm going to grab this more pigmented pink and I'm even going to mix a little bit of yellow into this just to make it a little bit more peachy and a little bit more warm. And I'm going to start with this petal here at the bottom. Now that's still pretty light, so I can add even more pigment there. And it's a good idea to place some color samples on just like a little strip of paper, just so that you have an idea even before you start laying it down. This is a pretty delicate pink flower, so I'm not going to go too strong on my shadows yet. And since we'll be doing some layering, it's okay if we don't have the exact right color to begin with. So since this card is small, we're using our small paintbrush here. I'm going to add a little water to it and kind of drag some of that color out I just laid down. And see how it makes a nice soft gradient there? Now if it's pooling too much and there's a big puddle there, I like to just pull a little paper towel and kind of soak up some of that paint. Now I want that to dry before layering, so I'm going to just skip over to the next petal where it's not touching it and to work out some of this shadow here. My sketch doesn't cover every single petal. It's really a guideline, so if I wanted to add this petal here, I can, or I can just have it blend into the rest of this petal here. So I just added more water to kind of drag that out. I'm going to soak up any extra. I'm going to skip over to this petal now because I don't want it touching. And since this is a little bit of a bigger area, I'm going to pull out my size 4 brush. And if your size 4 brush, if you're not loading it with too much paint, you could probably use it for all these petals. And I just added some water while that's still wet, and see how I rubbed right into the edge of that paint I laid down? Then I can just pull it out. It makes a nice soft gradient. I'm going to soak up that a little bit there. I like to think of my paper towel as like an eraser, and it works best if you can catch the mistakes while they're wet. So I'm keeping the darker areas closer to the center of the flower, and then I'm grabbing some water and I dab off a little, and then I paint right into it. And I just dab it right onto my paper towel just so that it's not soaking full of paint and water and it's not going to all spill out onto this petal. Since we have a smaller area, we're kind of controlling that a little bit more. And I'm even going to dab back some of this end to make it a little bit lighter on the tip. So I'm just looking for these darker shadows. I probably should have skipped this one because that's not completely dry, but we're going to go with it. And just try to not touch too much into that other petal. Watercolor is really about controlling the water flow, and the paint's just kind of along for the ride. So if you have too much water, it's not going to turn out unless you can control where it goes. In this case, we want to keep it a little bit lighter. So we have a little bit less paint and more water in our brush. I probably should have skipped over that one as well, but we're going to go back and define some of these shadowed areas, so it's okay. Add some water to my brush. Kind of scrub it right up to the end of the petal. I can even paint over this because it's wet, and it'll just make for a smoother transition there. So this is just water again. I'm going to go to this bottom petal now that those side ones are dry. It just takes a little bit of practice to figure out how much water and paint you should have on your brush. But once you get a feel for it, it's not too hard. So I'm going to add a little bit more here while this is still wet, and you can see I can just drop it right into that petal there. And then if I want to soften this edge, I can grab it while it's still wet with a damp brush. Okay, we're almost done with these initial petals. And I'm kind of looking at this reference photo, and even though this is underneath, it's still lighter than the petals below it. So we're still kind of following that guideline just to give it some dimension. And this is mostly water all up in here. I mostly just painted that with water on my brush, but since my brush isn't completely cleaned off, it has a hint of pink. Okay, we're gonna let that dry for a minute and move on to our stem and our leaves. So we're gonna pull out more of our sap green and let's grab a little bit of our burnt umber. So it's kind of more of an olive green color there. And then we're going to pull out some of our Viridian. This green is a little bit more blue. We're going to mix that with our sap green. So I'm just going to use my size 4 brush and I'm going to fill in these leaves. And you can use whatever greens you want. Basically, I'm just looking at the values of each of these leaves. So in this case, this leaf is darker on the inside here. I'm going to let that dry and move on to the next green. Move on to this leaf and it's basically the same color green. I just needed to mix a little bit more of that. I'm just filling it in. We're not going to get too detailed. The more pigment I mixed into that, the darker this green is going to be. I'm going to add a little bit of water to that on my brush just for the stem. And I'm just going to work my way straight down and catch these little leaf branches here while it's still wet, and it'll blend really nice into that stem. So I'm just going over those lines I had already placed. And then if I want, on the very end of the stem, I can grab some of my brown, just touch the bottom gently, and kind of pull it up while it's still wet, and it kind of creates that illusion of a clipped stem on the bottom. Okay, we're going to let those dry and then we'll work on the under part of those leaves. So let's move back to our flower. Make sure you rinse that out really good. We don't want any green on those petals. Let's paint our center with our azo yellow. I'm just going to fill it in, kind of these little brush strokes. I don't have to fill it in solid. I can kind of leave some white showing. And then I had quite a bit of paint on there, so I'm going to soak some of it up. And I'm going to grab my liner brush with some of my red. This is Permanent Red Light. And I'm going to just drop a few little dots in the middle there. Don't want to do too many. And I'm going to soak up that extra paint just at the bottom. I don't want to lift all of it. Now let's add a little bit of dimension to these petals. So you might notice you have some harsher edges like this one here. I had a lot of paint pooled up here, and so as it dried, the paint went towards the areas that were still wet, and so it left kind of a line. So if you want to get rid of that line, just get a damp, clean brush, and you can kind of scrub into it gently, and then use a little piece of paper towel and lift. So that's one way you can fix those edges that feel a little bit hard. All right, we're going to add a little bit of shadow, and I'm going to pull out that pink I was working with and just add a little bit of blue to it. And I'm going to look for the darkest points on these petals. So I needed a little bit more pigment in my brush. I might need to just grab it straight from my palette. That blue is very strong, so you gotta be careful not to grab too much. And I'm gonna look for these shadowed areas. I'm doing that same technique where I add water to kind of soften along the rest of the petal. So I'm looking for the dark points, and this really creates a lot of depth. And I like to do like little strokes like this, but you want to be careful not to make it too harsh of an outline. And I'm using my liner brush almost like a pencil where I'm sketching, almost like little hash mark type lines. That's getting a little bit blue for me, so I'm going to pull in a little more of that pink I have mixed up already and blend it in just along those points. So I'm just looking for those sections that are a little bit darker. I'm using these lines to create this feeling. It's kind of like a sketch, kind of like a drawing. If it's too harsh, I can grab a damp brush and just gently brush along the edges. I'm going to continue my way around, just looking for those darker points. It helps to look at each petal as just a shape. Don't think of it as a petal, just look at it as where are the blocks of color. And when you do that, it's easier to create these realistic looking flowers because you're not making it up in your head of what you think should be there, but you're painting what you actually see. I kind of simplified this petal at the bottom here. You can paint it like the reference photo, but I'm going to keep it a little bit simpler. Finding these dark points helps us kind of judge the rest of the values of the painting off of the darkest point. So I'm really looking for these shadowed, darker areas. That was a little bit harsh, so I'm going to grab my damp, clean brush, kind of rub it along there. I like incorporating this blue throughout the flower, just so it makes it feel more cohesive and pulled together. You're also welcome just to look at the finished scan of this painting and use it as a reference photo if it's hard for you to look at a photo from real life. Sometimes it's easier just to copy a painting instead of trying to see the brush strokes that you would make in a photo. So you see I'm using a lot of water. I want this to be a more delicate flower. I can dab back any areas that feel too harsh, and I can lift it with my liner brush as well. So some of these little corners are feeling a little hard. The edges are a little hard, so I can soften them back just with some water and a paper towel. I'm going to define the center of the flower a little bit. I'm just kind of creating these little lines that mimic the photo. So this is like the negative space in between each of these little pieces of the flower. And I can add more yellow and red in there too to add some shading. We're going to switch over now to the under part of these leaves. I'm just using that same color with more water. If I want it more blue, I'll use a little bit more of the Viridian. I'm just going to fill that in with my brush. You can go as detailed or as simple as you want on this. I'm going to add a little bit of my Payne's Gray to my green because I want to have this darker color I can add a little bit of detail and shadow with. So I'm going to add a little bit underneath the flower here, just so it feels like it has a shadow from this flower onto the stem. And I'm smoothing it out with some water. I'm going to add some of that darker detail to this part of the stem to create a little dimension. I'm not outlining the entire thing. I'm just kind of going in these corners where the leaves, where each leaf comes off. And then I can smooth it out with a damp brush, just so it's not quite as harsh. And if I wanted to, I could draw some little lines on the leaf as well. You can look at the picture where the lines are on the leaf, or you can kind of make it up as you go. Just want to add a little bit of detail to these. I'm still keeping it pretty transparent though. I don't want to do any super heavy, harsh lines that will distract from the rest of the painting. Add a little bit more shadow into the very bottom part of these leaves on the inside. It's going to add a little bit more depth here. For this last part, I'm going to use some of my white acrylic paint. And I like these Posca paint pens, just they have a really nice consistency to them, but you can use any white acrylic paint you have. So always make sure you shake it first. And I have a little bit poured into this cap. And I might need to add a little bit of water. It's starting to dry out. I'm just going to find some of these highlighted areas. And I don't want to go too heavy with this because it's an opaque paint. I don't want to lose the transparency from all of my watercolors. So this is just a good way to layer on top. And I'm looking for the lightest highlights on this flower. So I'll notice there's some along the tips of these petals. I'm going to add a little bit of texture on the center part, and then I'm going to go over that again with another layer of paint once it's dry. So you don't have to do this step. I just like the ability it creates to add more layers and interest. It's often best to try to just preserve the white on your paper. That's the traditional way of working with watercolors, but sometimes it's fun to do it this way. Just kind of defining the edges of some of these petals that got a little lost in our painting. I'm still careful not to just outline things. I want to keep it kind of organic without too straight of lines. All right, I'm not going to get too crazy with that white paint. Make sure you rinse your brush out really well if you use that, because it can dry in your bristles. So before I move on, I'm going to dry this completely because I want to make sure it's totally dry, and I will use a hairdryer. You can just wait if you want. You can test to see if it's dry. If it feels cool, it's probably not dry yet. So I'm gonna go and add a tiny bit of green into this flower. So if you look carefully, there's a little bit of green coming through here. These petals are transparent. So part of the flower is gonna have a tiny bit of green here. Just makes it feel a little bit more natural. And then now that I have my lightest and my darkest points on here, I can kind of see what values I need to adjust. So I'm gonna use my size 4 brush, and I'm gonna lift any areas that just kind of stand out and feel a little too harsh. I'm just really gently painting over those shadowed areas that are sticking out a little too strongly. I can also lift paint in areas where I want a little more of a highlight coming through, like this. I lost a little bit of the light part there. So I'm just checking my reference photo and I'm scrubbing back any areas I want to soften and lighten. You have to be careful not to scrub too hard or too long in one spot because it can damage the paper and lift it a bit. And then it makes it harder to layer on top. Just smooth out that transition a little here. And I can also see the parts that I want to darken a little bit now that I've added my white. I'm just going to add a few more shadows. I'm mostly using the pink for this part. I can be quick to lift it if it's feeling a little too dark with my paper towel. Now I want to add a layer on top of the center part that I added the white highlights to, so I'm just grabbing a little bit of yellow, painting right on top. If you use a white ink, it can reactivate painting on top. That's why I prefer using a permanent acrylic paint, but it really just depends which you like. Then I can just go ahead and adjust any final things that are bugging me. The hardest part of watercolors is knowing when to stop. I'm just adding a few more of these kind of sketch-like lines. Just to add a little bit of interest. I'm kind of looking at how the petals overlap, and if one petal is kind of disappearing, look for the petal behind it or in front of it and see which one needs to be darker. All right, I could paint this all day, but I'm going to stop myself here. To fold this card, there's several ways you could do this. The way I like to do it is I like to kind of create a track. And I use my paper cutter. It just has like a little ridge in here, and I'll line it up. You can also just use a ruler. I like this way because it kind of keeps me on the right course. And then I get rid of all of the lead. So it's just the metal nub of my mechanical pencil. And I just gently push all the way down this line. I know they have tools for this. If you have card making supplies, I don't have any. This works just as well. And now my paper knows where to bend. So I just really gently guide it. If it's not bending as well, it's easier sometimes to bend it this way too. Just want to be really gentle because you don't want the paper to bend along the painting. So I can grab my ruler, place it straight down along that edge, and then lift. I can just push right up against it. And then once it kind of has that memory where it needs to fold, you can really push it down flat. There is our flower card. This is great for Mother's Day, a get well card, a birthday card. I love that it doesn't have any writing on it, so you can use it for any occasion. So you can create your own envelope if you want. I know there's patterns online you can find. I just have these 5x7 envelopes that are white, and then you can just slide it right in, and it's ready to mail. If you liked painting with me today, you're going to love my summer camp course. I have all of these paintings available with all the sketches ready for you to paint, and you can find it linked below.